This is the Ready for Takeoff podcast, episode 545. My name is George Nolly, and today I'm going to talk about ValueJet 592. But first, let me tell you about our sponsor, the Ham-Fist novel series. As you know, there's an audiobook now based on my experiences in Vietnam. It's called Ham-Fist Over the Trail, and you can get that audiobook totally free if you go to freehamfist.com. Sign up for an account with Audible, get the book, and then if you don't like having the service at Audible, you can cancel your account and you still get to keep that book. I recommend you keep your service. It's great. But right now, fasten your seatbelts and get ready for takeoff. So ValueJet 592 was a landmark aircraft accident because a lot of changes were made to the aviation industry as a result of that. It occurred in May of 1996. ValueJet was a really lousy airline, had a lot of sloppy maintenance, and they were flying DC-9s, old airplanes, and there were a lot of problems with the airline prior to this accident. Now, this accident was a result of a fuselage fire. And if you looked at our previous, I think it was episode 359, the story of Nigerian 2120, you'll realize that a fuselage fire is one of the worst things that can happen to a crew. And this was a fuselage fire and the same disastrous results. What happened was there were some COMAT, that's company material, tires, stored in the cargo pit of the DC-9. And that's not unusual to have COMAT. That's airlines use that all the time to transport material from one place to another that's needed by the airline. In this case, there were two aircraft tires. One of them was mounted on a wheel assembly. And in addition, there were some oxygen generators that were put in the same cargo compartment. Now, chemical oxygen generators are not unusual. In fact, on the 737 aircraft and the overhead compartment on the passenger service unit above each seat, there are chemical oxygen generators, and those are used in the event of a decompression. You pull the mask down and place it over your nose and mouth, and when you pull the lanyard on the oxygen generator, it will produce oxygen. It'll produce about 15 minutes worth of oxygen, and in the process, the oxygen generator gets very hot. Well, oxygen generators need to be transported, and they can be transported in aircraft. However, it's against federal aviation regulations to transport them in passenger aircraft cargo holds. But the company that prepared these oxygen generators for shipment was a company called Sabertech, and they put 144 expired chemical oxygen generators in the hold of the DC-9. Each of these chemical oxygen generators is fairly small. Like I said, they fit in the overhead compartment of your aircraft. They are about the size of a tennis ball can. And they were supposedly expired, but that didn't mean that they did not have oxygen in them. And here's the problem. Somehow during taxi, the chemical oxygen generators probably got jostled, and the first one, at least one, started to activate. And it caused a fire. And when the fire started, it caused other oxygen generators to activate. And the oxygen fueled the fire. So now the tires are burning very hot. And they were in what's called a Class D cargo compartment. So a Class D cargo compartment is a cargo compartment which is totally sealed, so that if there's a fire, the fire theoretically will not propagate to the aircraft. There's no fire detection or extinguishing equipment in a Class D compartment. We used to say a Class D, when you open it, that's where you find the dead dogs and cats that were shipped, because there's not any flow of air. It's just a sealed compartment. But the fire was hot enough that it extended past the Class D fire compartment and got into the fuselage. And it burned through control cables also. So it was pandemonium back in the cabin. The flight attendant reported to the cockpit that they were on fire. They immediately tried to return back. The entire flight lasted only 10 minutes. But in the process, they lost control of the aircraft because the flight controls had been burned through. And they crashed in the Everglades, not too far from where Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed. And you've heard about Eastern 401 on a previous podcast episode. As a result of this accident, of course, ValueJet was a lousy airline to begin with, and they ended up going out of business, or actually consolidating. But as a result of this accident, the FAA required all Class D cargo compartments to be converted about 20 years ago to Class C or Class E. So in a Class C or Class E cargo compartment, you have fire detection and fire protection equipment. So what do you have? In those cargo compartments, the way you sense a fire is by smoke detectors. And then you can discharge through a series of halon bottles, you can discharge halon into the appropriate cargo compartment. There is a problem with, I have to tell you that there is a problem with the current system that we have for Class C and Class E cargo compartments, and that is there's smoke detectors. So smoke detectors detect particles in the air, like smoke particles. But you can have false alarms because if you're carrying flowers, for example, there's some misting from flowers and they can set off the smoke detectors. The mist from the flowers can look like smoke. And also, when you discharge halon into a cargo compartment, it looks like smoke to the smoke detectors. So once you've discharged the halon, the fire alarm may continue, and you may think that the fire has continued when in fact it was simply the halon setting off the smoke detectors. Those are things that crew members are aware of. And I have to tell you a quick story because the smoke detectors in the lavatories also detect smoke particles. And one time I had a lavatory smoke detector. I had a lavatory fire alarm on a flight I was operating, where it turned out the lavatory was not on fire. There were some moths, because here in Denver we have a Miller moth infestation every year. In fact, it's right now in October. And there were some moths in the lavatory, and the dust from the wings of the moth set off the smoke detector. So it appeared as though there was a fire in the lavatory, although I had the flight attendant touch the door, and the door was cool, so she could open the door and look at it. But anyway, that's the story of ValueJet 592. Now, in our show notes, we do have a video that is a recreation of the accident, and also we have the actual accident report from ValueJet 592, plus another link to a description of the different types of cargo compartments there are. Once again, like all of our midweek podcasts, if there's something that your company is telling you that's different from what we say, that takes priority.
Thanks again for listening. Subscribe now to the Ready for Takeoff podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, and please rate us and post a review on the iTunes Store. For show notes, resources, and more, head over to readyfortakeoffpodcast.com.